All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us live here. My name is Andrea Sampson. I'm the CEO and founder of Talk Boutique and, of course, of the Thought Leader Academy. I have Ian Keeling joining us today. Ian has been working with us here at Talk Boutique for almost 6 years. He is an award-winning author, a science fiction author, a master storyteller, although he didn't want me to say that, so I'm going to say it anyway. But he is also faculty at Second City, a trained actor, and an incredible coach and facilitator. As I said, Ian and I have been working together for many years, and we talk about storytelling often. And so I thought I would ask the ultimate question to start off, which is, what is a story, Ian?
Yeah, it's funny. You just hit me with this right before we let everyone in. And I was like, oh, cool. We're starting strong. So in the 7 seconds that I thought of the answer to that, the immediate thing that came to mind for me was it is a shared experience. And the reason why I said, oh, we're starting strong is because there's obviously a lot to what is a story. Literally, there are entire university courses on it. I'm sure we'll talk about a few details. But to me, and one of the reasons why I think storytelling is so important in everything that we do is it's basically a shared experience. Sometimes, by the way, it's a made-up experience. I write science fiction and fantasy and those kind of books, and most of that stuff, as far as I know, hasn't happened yet. Certainly hasn't happened to me. But it's that moment that connects human beings, and it's in a way where we're sharing something with one person or perhaps a group. And in that shared experience, we connect. So I guess that's that's my emotional answer to the question, as opposed to, going into the history of storytelling and all of that kind of stuff.
No, I love that, a shared experience. Today's session, we called it the science of storytelling. And I think, those of us who are in the world of storytelling, we know that not only is story a shared experience, but it's a shared experience that we live together. So it's like, so your story, the story that you're telling me, starts to get filled in with my details, which is so interesting, right? You might be telling me even a fantastical story that perhaps you've made up, but my brain goes to the place of my own experiences, and it starts populating my memory and your words with what I already know. And I think that's one of the cool things about storytelling. And, as an author and as a writer and as a storyteller, tell me, how do you use that? Is that something that you consciously use in your work?
The idea of creating, so do I deliberately try to create those connections with the audience? The answer to that is yes. By the way, I'm in the process of editing a book. And so I'm in a very highly editive mode. So I'm going to end up being probably overly precise and, try to analyze every single sentence, as opposed to what you should do in a first draft, which is just answer the question and see what happens. I'm going to sort of take a step back and almost reverse that, because the thing that I find I have the privilege of telling some of my own stories, but more importantly, I've had the privilege in so many different experiences I've had, whether it's teaching improv classes at Second City, doing public speaking coaching. I get to hear people's stories, and I'll get to hear someone's story for the first time. So I have no context at all. And I find it amazing that how often, without fail, whether I'm going around a classroom going, hey, everybody just take a minute, tell me about why you're taking this course. Hey, tell me something that happened to you this week. I'm not going to say always, because I don't like hyperbole, even though I put a lot of it in my writing. Almost without fail, somebody will tell me something, and within 30 seconds, my brain makes that connection that you did. It'll remind me of an experience. And sometimes the connections, I go, oh, well, that's why I thought of that thing. And sometimes I would have to step back and go, why the heck did that remind me of that? Oh, because there's 3 steps down the road and we got there. When I'm telling a story, there's certain things that you do when you're telling a story, certainly using emotional language. I'm literally working on a chapter right now talking about being more specific with your language, because oddly enough, by being more specific, you actually make broader connections.
Mm.
Uh, but in terms of sort of trying to elicit a deliberate connection from an audience, if I have a message I'm trying to pass on, yes, I'm trying to share that message. But my joy is the fact that I don't know how an audience is necessarily going to connect to a story. I just know they will. That's the thing, is that if there's an idea we're trying to pass on, okay, now we want to make that idea clear. But the actual way that somebody connects to the story enough that they're listening intently so that they do connect to that story, what's great is you never know how an audience will do that. Right? If you
Mhm,
know something about your
mhm.
audience, maybe you're going to try and use some of their language. They're more likely to connect to things like that. So there are certain things that you can do. But stories are these wonderful things where the human brain is designed to go in an unconscious way. Oh, hey, we've been there. And you would have never consciously, rationally gone, well, I've done that. But your unconscious brain goes, no, 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 trust me. Trust me, we've been in that room.
Yeah. You know, I think as storytellers, this is something that we think about a lot, right?
Yeah,
We are constantly looking at the stories of our lives and realizing that really our lives are just really one big long story, and we can create all kinds of little short stories within. Um, Before I get to our next question, I actually just want to address everyone who's joining us and say, we'd love to hear from you as well. If you've got questions, there are hundreds of different ways that we could unpack storytelling, and Ian and I are just going to have a great conversation today, but feel free to weigh in. We're going to make
yeah,
sure that we get to your questions, so if you have any, drop them into the comments below. We've also given people, and I believe we've given them access to some of our tools. So the Story Spine, if you haven't downloaded it, I highly recommend you do that. Because, the thing about storytelling is that it is powerful, but made more powerful when we do it in a way that connects with our audience. And frameworks are helpful for that. Our Story Spine is one of, like, there are literally thousands of frameworks for storytelling, but we like the Story Spine because of the simplicity of it and the ease of it. And so I believe it's in the comments down below. So go ahead and download that, and also drop your questions in. So I'm going to get back to our talks about storytelling. I remember many years ago, I was working with um, a couple of different neuroscientists, and learning, about the brain and how the brain processes information. And one of the things that I learned in that work was that our brain is both associative and predictive. And what I mean by that is it needs something to associate to. So memories are made through association, and it's predictive, meaning that our brain is always microseconds into the future. It's always predicting what's coming next. And so story is almost custom made for story, right? That's why we engage with story, because it's giving us the things to associate to. And of course, it's keeping it, what a good storyteller knows, this keeps us on the edge of our seat. What are some of the tools that you use, Ian, when you're storytelling or when you're teaching storytelling to help people with those associations and with those abilities to create
yeah.
a predictive nature?
So, so um, what's interesting about prediction is literally, I was like, oh, maybe we'll talk about the story spine, and like, especially because there's a few areas that I often feel like, hey, pay a little bit more attention here. But the connections that our brain makes. So you mentioned the predictive thing, and I'm going to throw this in because I have no idea if it has anything to do with professional development. But when you mentioned the predictive thing, so one of my little pet peeves with the way television and movies, but especially television, long-term storytelling, um, uh, that's happened in, say, the last couple of decades, is this idea of when you write a something with a mystery in it, right, and you're trying to fool or trick your audience, right? And there's shows like Lost that have struggled with this kind of conundrum. And one of the things that I've been saying in random conversations in bars or wherever, or writing conventions is, and I think a few very successful shows recently made this mistake, and it helped made them struggle with some of their endings, is if you're trying to trick your audience, the internet ruined that, because there's now 8 billion detectives. Odds are one of them's going to figure it out, because human beings are so good at predicting things. And I think sometimes writers, authors, anybody creative loses sight of the fact that one of the great joys of an audience is when they're actually given what they want. So the weird thing is, you don't have to fool the audience. You can lead them there. And when you do the reveal, it's even satisfying if they did guess it in the end.
Mhm.
That's why Romeo and Juliet, 6 lines into that play, 2 star-crossed lovers lose their lives. I think I just butchered that exact quote, but we know how that story ends. There's no magic twist. It's the journey there. So that's just the connection, again, that my brain went when you said predictive. Now, when you're talking about associations, though, so you mentioned our story spine, and while I said I don't always know how the audience is going to make connections or things like that, there are certain things that an audience needs in a story. There's certain sort of structural things, and then there's sort of, micro minutia kind of details. But every story needs to have a strong beginning, and one of the most important parts, if we're going to understand a story, whether it's a story that we're just sharing for entertainment value, or we're actually trying to share one with a message, is we need to actually understand the world that it takes place. We don't always have to start right away with explaining it, but we get there pretty quickly. Even those movies you see where it starts in like media res, there's action movies where it's like, oh no, aliens, everything's going crazy. And you're like, oh, it started all really, really heavily. Almost always within like a minute or two, there's like a wipe, and then it's like 24 hours earlier. And, all of a sudden you're hearing, a radio, someone listening to a podcast. It's a beautiful day in LA. And it's like, honey, I got to get to the meeting, can you take the kids? And all of a sudden, we've learned who and what and where, which is the building blocks of a scene. Is we need to understand who's in the story and where it takes place. It's one of the places where I think, especially when we're using professional stories, like say a case study or like a sales pitch, I wish people would put just a little bit more human detail into those things, because that's the other things is, and you mentioned this, we connect to facts, but we connect to that human element, those people elements, that much more. So when we're talking about associations, the thing we first have to do is just give enough context that now the audience can start making its own connections. But you do have to at least provide that level of detail, even if it's something like, we were doing inventory and it's like, oh, okay, I'm 3/4 of the way there now.
Well, I think you've just said something that's really, important to sort of call out, which is you're in that story. I'm doing
Yeah.
inventory, right? We're not saying, the other day I was at this place doing inventory. No, I'm doing inventory. And there's a difference. It feels different. The association is different. When you're in the moment, in the first person telling that story,
Yeah.
I'm with you, because I'm now sort of watching over your shoulder as the audience, right? Watching you doing inventory versus you and me standing back looking at this past event of what happened. And I think that there's, not only does it feel different, but there's a different level of attention that comes with that. Would you agree?
Yeah, because the funny thing is, it's always we, even if you're hearing someone tell a story of like, I did this, even if you're hearing a story where you're reading it in the first person, we get to join that person. And yes, there's an element of like, it's in some writing books, and especially in comedy, they sometimes call it the attractive fantasy, where we're living through somebody else's life, and they do a few things where it's like, oh, I might not normally do that, but the reason why it's attractive is because, oh, maybe I've felt that way, or maybe I've seen that thing. And I mean, I threw out the thing inventory. I don't know that I've ever had a job where I actually had to do inventory. But I can't count the number of colleagues, friends, family who have done the thing where I'm like, hey, do you want to go out Friday night? And they're like, can't, it's in the end of the month and we're going to be in here. I've had people ask me to come and help them with it sometimes. So I have experience with it, even if it's like, oh, I don't actually know the minutia of like what goes into that.
Right. But you
And
can
so,
imagine it. You
well,
can
that's the
imagine
thing.
it. And when somebody like even that, like I said, unfortunately, I actually had to count bacon slices in one
Yeah,
of
I
my
hear
jobs.
inventory is fun, by the way. I hear it's
Yeah,
like,
in a
hmm,
freezer, bacon slices. Anyway,
you were in the
inventory.
freezer having to do the
Yes,
inventory?
yes, yes. It was my very first job. I worked
Hmm.
in a very famous fast food joint. And that was what I had to do at 6 o'clock in the morning, was count bacon slices. Anyway, that's a whole other story. But the point is that it doesn't matter whether we've had the experience. When somebody brings us along with them, when they're telling us a story through inclusive language, I was doing this thing, I'm in the freezer counting bacon slices. You're already getting a mental image, and I think that's one of the powers. I could add to that and say it was freezing, and I'm sleep deprived, so that
Yeah.
it feels even colder, and
But
I can
what's
smell the
interesting with
food.
this is, and I would be curious to see if the audience, how many people in our audience had the same reaction that I did, because I stopped you,
Yes.
right? When you said, wait, you had me at freezer. Because I have certainly never had a job where I had to count things in a freezer. And I don't know if I've ever worked where I had to spend extensive time in a freezer. But I've been cold. I have been that cold, and especially in a place where I don't need to be here and be this cold. What's going on? But I had an immediate emotional connection, because even though I've never been there, I don't know where this freezer is. I don't know what job you had where you had to count the bacon. But immediately I had an empathy reaction.
Yeah.
It could be empathy for you and the concern for you because I know you, but also sometimes it bounces back on ourselves of like, everybody at least has been in a place that they didn't want to be, doing something they didn't want to
Yeah.
do. And the
Want to do.
environment was a problem. And immediately, even though in that case, I didn't have a conscious memory in
Yeah.
terms of an association, I immediately I emotionally connected you to the point where I stopped you. And then B, also, I just interrupted you to talk about it. And also to find out, I said, I wonder how many other people in the audience were like, yeah, that doesn't sound like fun at all. And the
Right.
reason why we're able to say that is because we have been there. You wouldn't say that doesn't sound like fun unless you've been somewhere where it's like, oh no, I don't know what that feels like. Obviously the bacon would be, I guess, a little slimy, but we know that feeling of uncomfortability and the environment just being wrong.
And what I find interesting about this conversation that we're having, because we're talking about storytelling, but all of it just came from an offhanded remark you made about doing
Yeah,
inventory, which neither of us clearly have made a career where inventory is a part of our world. And yet we can connect with each other on something that neither of us actually do. We can
yeah.
connect with the audience who's here with us. Some of you may actually count inventory. I hope none of you are doing it in a freezer counting bacon, but maybe you are. Um, but the point being is that when we have these shared connections, and when those shared connections start to, as you were just saying, include emotions, because what did we do? We activated some sensory regions in our brain, the cold,
Yeah.
so we could feel it,
And you
the,
just remember how I said I didn't make a conscious association. So I just did. And now some of this will probably be because we're doing, a seminar right now. We're having a conversation that involves professional development, right? We're talking about the Thought Leader Academy. But it did make me go, oh, of course, there's a conscious association here there's a common example I sometimes use for storytelling in some of our workshops, where I talk about, there was a client I worked with about a couple of years ago, and they had a case study in the middle of one of their talks, and they needed to liven it up. It was a great case study. A case study is a story. And this case study, by the way, had a great, clear message. It was about like incorporating artificial intelligence. By the way, this was 2 years ago. What I'm about to say might seem a little relevant now, but it was about incorporating artificial intelligence into large traditional corporate structures. And in the middle, they had this one of the sub messages they had was about building trust. You have to be able to, and there's 2 tiers you need within every specific corporation. One, you actually need people to trust the concept of artificial intelligence and that it can be used in this situation. And then you also have to trust how your company will
Mhm.
implement it. responsibly in a way that people can understand and utilize and benefit from. It was a great case study. I've remembered the message. It laid out everything clearly, but I was like, it felt a little like a textbook. So all I
Right.
did was ask them a couple of questions, and this is where we're kind of connecting to your freezer. I asked them, first of all, where did it, I always like to focus a little bit on the people in place. Just give me a little extra love there and give me some details that maybe aren't from a textbook or a report. And so I said, well, where did you do this? Was it like, were you doing virtual consulting? Were you doing whatever? And they said, oh, no. We flew out to their head office. I went, where's that? And they said, Saskatchewan. And because I'm Canadian, and because almost instinctively, if you're Canadian, you'll go, when did you do it? Like spring, summer, winter? And he laughed and went, middle of February. And I went, okay, so you're in Saskatchewan in the middle of February for a week. And I said, well, were you in, like, was this one of those offices where it's like kind of new open concept? A lot of places are like that. I got about that far and I went, small room, no windows, 1 week. And I was like, all right, so you are in, and it's funny because when you think about it, small room, no windows, and it's cold. We're in the fridge. And just that little detail immediately made me emotionally I'm now right away emotionally connected to what is going to be a case study. I then, by the way, also did people, little details about people, little specific details. So I just said, was there anything about the company in general, the people you worked with, could be even just one specific person that, it doesn't have to be, oh, they were professional or they were really competent or whatever. And he said, well, actually, our liaison, she had just moved from Uruguay about 6 months previous to that. And I went, so you were working with a woman who had spent her whole life in South America, and now she was experiencing the joys of the Canadian prairies in the middle of February. And now I'm emotionally connected to the people in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still a case study. But the reason why I tell this story in workshops is because, and you'll have had this experience, every client I have is essential. Every client is important, but also I don't remember everything. You hear a lot. It's impossible for us to automatically remember everything. I remember that when you incorporate AI into large corporate structures, trust is something you need to build. And there's a couple of ways you need to think about it. So I got emotionally connected to that case study. And it was also in the middle. So it actually set a change of tone and pace. And so that not only do I remember that, but when I'm having a conversation where I've never heard you tell the fridge story or the bacon thing. But when you tell that story and I take like a nanosecond to think about it at all in depth, I go, oh, this is a little, your experience. The fridge counting bacon during inventory, it really isn't that different from small room, no windows in the middle of Saskatchewan. And those little specific human details, that's what makes us listen to the content.
And it's also what helps us to remember. We talked about the story spine, and for those of you that have downloaded it, what we've just done, Ian and I, is we've talked about the very first piece on that story spine, which is the environment. It's the sense of place. It's where the story is happening. And so that's what you've just heard, is us talking about that. And Ian did such a great job of talking about, don't just say, I was doing inventory, or I was meeting in a room. I was in Saskatchewan in the middle of the Canadian winter.
You were counting
with
bacon.
Yes.
Like bacon was such a simple, specific detail, but I mean, the image of somebody counting bacon in a freezer, I'm like, yeah, if you want to give me more details, great, but
Right.
I'm in.
And that's it. The environment it brings us in. And then when you start talking about the people, in Ian's story, a woman who has spent most of her life closer to the equator, right? And so, that tells us something. It doesn't have to be a lot. When we're telling stories as parts of presentations, as parts of our daily life in our job, we often don't have a lot of time to set them up, but it's important that we do. And the environment and the characters are a really great way to bring in our audience. And what happens next on that story spine is we go into what we call the, it's the sort of the point of the story. It's the reason why you're telling it. And that, so Ian and I haven't even gotten to the point of any of the stories, because we actually don't have points on the stories. We're just talking about stories. But if we did, this is the place where we would reveal, in Ian's case, because his was actually a case study, it probably had a point. There was probably a reason.
Yeah.
But I'm going to guess, and I'll ask the question: did the person who was telling you that case study, did they start with the reason they were telling you that story?
When we sort of did the first draft, when I was coaching them, yeah, they
Yeah,
often started with that,
and they usually
because we want to
and
jump to the what's it all about. And I see this in, say, someone doing a speech, but I've been seeing it for 20 years in artistic classes where we're working on storytelling. Could be something where it's like acting or improv, we're up on our feet. Could be something where it's like literally just a writing class. And it is, but improv is interesting because there is no script. And it is amazing how often people in the first 10 to 15 seconds want to get to, we got to get to the conflict. We got to get to what the story is going to be about. And I'm like, you can slow down a little bit. And it doesn't take a lot of details. As we've mentioned, one or two details sometimes get you there. If we're trying to lay the picture of the world, one sentence, sometimes you're
yeah,
good. You're not wasting people's time.
and
And then especially because you're telling a story that does have a point. And there
yeah,
are stories we tell just to entertain, but
and I
the
think
ones that we're, sorry.
there's sorry, and but I
Yeah.
think there's a couple of different points in the point, right? Like, because we've got a reason why we're telling the story. So often there'll be
Yeah.
something in there'll be the crux of that story itself. And we, as humans, we want to get to that point. We don't want to lose our listener. We want to get there and give them that, here's the thing you need to know. And now let me tell you how I got here. The
Yeah.
problem with that, of course, is that as soon as you tell them that thing, if it wasn't contextualized in any way, it's not meaningful. And that's part of what the environment and the characters do, is they start to contextualize that point. But even that point, the story, the reason you're telling the story can have even a bigger reason. We can build to something where it
Hmm.
becomes almost an analogy, right?
Yeah.
Where we can use a story to unpack a hard to understand concept. And I think when we tell case studies, we think we're doing that through problem and solution. And I think that that's a bit of a flawed premise myself, because I think when we identify a problem and give a solution, we've done it so factually often that we actually haven't given the audience any way to really remember it. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah. And I also think people think in different ways. I tend to be more abstract imagery kind of based. I tend to be great with the big picture, but oddly enough, unless I'm in an editing mode, I sometimes miss the specifics. So the other thing about a story is often it's providing context, but not just stories inherently, especially if you just put any kind of depth in them, you're immediately providing not just, oh, it's one different type of context because I'm telling a story. There's usually multiple contexts within it. There's multiple ways that your audience can make the connection. That's why analogies are so powerful, is we all learn in different ways. But sometimes if you give me the thing in one way, I'll be like, oh, I think I get it. Then you give me the thing in a slightly different way, using different language or different perspective. Sometimes, by the way, I have people who are only using analogies. I'm like, okay, cool. Give a couple of facts. And then the person goes,
Yes.
oh, I get it. And so that's the big thing, is also if we present something in only one dimension, we're putting a lot of onus on our audience. Whereas if we show it from a few different angles, now it's easier to understand it, especially
Yeah.
with complex things.
Complex. Yeah. I mean, we do so much work, you and I, with people who have very, very complex messages. And I think, over the years of doing this work, it's one of the things that I've really come to appreciate about story is how it's a shortcut, right?
Yeah.
Where, especially when we're working with scientists and academics, where the information that they have is big and meaty and complex and hard to understand for the most part. But yet, and if you had to explain it, it would take hours and hours or even days. But sometimes a story can shortcut all of that. It
Yeah.
takes us right to the heart of what it is that that information is getting us to. And rather than having to explain all the messy middle, all the bits along the way that got us to that idea, we can use a story and then simply, using a couple of transitional statements. The reason I tell you this is because, and now
Yeah.
we're into that idea. And I love that about story. Any examples of that you've had in recent days?
Oh, you're asking somebody who spent most of his week a little under the weather, so my brain
Yeah.
is uh, nothing immediately off the top, because most of the people I'm working with are actually at content creation, so they
Yeah.
haven't hit the point where they're working in stories yet. We just with some of the ones that we recently finished. The big thing is, if you get people to care, they instinctively feel why something is important.
Yeah.
There was we worked with somebody in Boston, an ophthalmologist, and he was talking about a specific eye condition. And But he opened with just talking about astronomy. And his big message was that, no matter what eye condition we're working on, we actually also have to make sure that doctors have a different perspective than patients. And so he used this astronomy analogy of, if an astronomer looks at the stars and they discover one new star, that's exciting, but they're not, well, it's like there's millions and millions of stars. And this was very poetic. He said, yeah, but the star probably cares a lot. And it's that just idea of, a lot of times as professionals, we might see a big picture. And sometimes, I just mentioned this, sometimes we can lose the fact that the perspective from the one person might be a little different. And so I that was one
Yeah.
where
That
I
was,
just remember I think we were 20 seconds into his talk and already I was going, huh. I mean,
yeah, it was,
you know,
I was in the audience at that talk, and it was a beautiful talk because it really did, and like to your point with doctors um, and researchers, they can get very caught up in the big picture. And when the moment happens where it's like, and the patient in front of you or the person in front of you is really the only person that
yeah,
matters in that moment. And that's what that talk did, was it brought it from, the research of, curing eye disease to that one, in his case, child
yeah,
who suddenly was saying, but maybe that's not for me. And there was
yeah,
such power in that.
yeah. And not
In
only that, I love space, so oh, it's obvious I'm going to like that analogy. But the
course.
reason why I think he connected to, so much of that audience was the fact that even if you're not somebody like me, where I've literally tried to watch every movie about NASA, and I'll tell you about Scott Carpenter, and I get into that kind of stuff. Most people, if they've looked up at the stars at some point in their life, maybe not every time, but they've had an emotional reaction to that. So automatically, that analogy is inherently almost universally. Obviously, we're talking about eye doctors, so some people are blind and may not have seen the stars. On the other hand, they've probably been about near somebody who went, wow. So they're like 1 degree of separation, even if you
Yeah.
actually couldn't see them in the first place.
And this has been fascinating. I'm just looking at the time, and I think we're a few minutes over now.
Oh yeah, I'll
We
talk for
could talk
hours.
about this for hours. I want to, first of all, thank you. This has been a
Yeah,
great conversation. For those of you who are still with us, thank you. And again, if you haven't checked out the Thought Leader Academy, please do. There's a link on our Talk Boutique page. You can check out how to become a member. You'd work with both Ian and I in the Thought Leader Academy, and we would love to see you. We teach really fun things like storytelling. And for those of you who have downloaded the Story Spine, use it. I really encourage you. There's lots of directions within the Story Spine that we've given you. Use it. You will find it to be incredibly powerful, whether it's at the beginning of a presentation or whether it's at your next dinner party. It does not need to be written. You can use the Story Spine to help you to engage whatever audience, whether they be a group of children or a group of ophthalmologists. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your attention. And if there is anything that we can help you with, please reach out. Both Ian and I are here on LinkedIn. I'm very, very active. Talk Boutique, of course, is here and active as well. Direct message us, reach out, and check out the Thought Leader Academy. Thank you again for your time today. Have a beautiful Friday and a great weekend.